Larry Malkus, thank you for coming out today for the podcast. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
It's about time we've got you on. You were always right next door, office right there, and I always have the sense that I ask so many English teachers, so I'm glad that we're doing this.
No worries.
How did you, get to Gilman is my first question for you.
It's a great story. So maybe a little differently than some people. My first real job outside of college was working for Towson State University at the time in the internship and cooperative education office. And but it was a contractual state position, so it had no benefits, no days off, nothing. And I got tired of that, and I went to a temp agency downtown. This was like 96. And said, I'll take any job. Just find me a job where I can get like medical benefits and retirement, stuff like that. The next thing I know, I was interviewing for a development position, a database manager position, which is ironic because I was kind of a technophobe. But Kate Radcliffe hired me, the former director of development, and I was in development at Gilman for 2 years. And then the position of assistant in the college counseling office opened. So what Rebecca Scott does now. And I thought, well, I'd love to move over to the academic side of the school, out of development at least. And they were very supportive, so I did that. Eva Turner was the director of college counseling, so I was her assistant for about 2 years. And she said, Larry, why don't you try taking a class of English 9, a section, because I had studied English in college. I had been an English major for a while, and then an education major for a little while, and then ultimately a theater major when I graduated. But she said, take a class, take these 10 or 20 college counselees, and give it a shot and see what you think. So I did, and then ultimately was a college counselor with 2 sections, and then right at the time that Mr. Baker was looking to transition to college counselor, I was looking to transition to just teaching, so we switched. But that's how it started.
So you can get into college counseling without having any degree or have done it before? You can just become a counselor?
Yeah, because I was the assistant in the office for a couple of years, I got to watch, Eva and
right.
At that time Ned Harris and Jeff Christ and a few other folks, college counselors. But yeah, I don't think there is. I eventually got my master's in school counseling, and there's you take a class in college counseling as part of your graduate program, but I don't think there's a dedicated track to college counseling.
Was that a tough learning curve when you first came and you were advising or helping students with the whole college process?
Had I not been the assistant in the office, it would have definitely been, but Eva made it very simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really did come down to, and Gilman prides itself on where its students go, so it's not something that can be downplayed necessarily in the community. But Eva was very clear that this was the result of a student's work in the upper school, and that's really what determined it. So the idea that there was something that college counselors can do to affect an outcome.
You're right.
Other than be real familiar with schools and
right. You'd figure
familiar with their charges, their counselees. Other than that, there's really it's mostly hand-holding and guidance.
Yeah, I was thinking that a lot of that job must be sitting down with students and families and just trying to steer them in the right direction, the direction that makes sense.
Exactly.
We've had a couple of college counselors come on, and I've been curious about that because it seems like a interesting position. I mean, I think about that around this time of the year when I'm writing the college recommendation letters, and I don't know, just thinking about how bridging the gap between expectations and reality, and it's so competitive, right. And there's so much pressure going on. It's dealing with a lot of those, different variables.
Yep. And I think that along with there is some fun stuff, you take trips to visit colleges and you become familiar with what they offer so that you can match students with schools that you're familiar with. But I think what our office does so well, in addition to putting together like balance lists for students where they're going to meet a lot of success, is the school recommendations. You were mentioning the teacher recs. They write sort of a comprehensive 4-year counselor recommendation, and that's really apart from the students' essays, I think that the school recommendation offers the best snapshot of a student for a school.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big deal.
When you first got into the English 9 classroom, what was that like for you? And maybe what are some ways that you've kind of tried to stay the same and developed over the course of your career? Because you still teach English 9, right? And it's interesting that that's the class that you started with.
Right. So I observed Dan Christian and John E. Schmick, so John Schmick's dad, who had both been longtime English 9 teachers. Eva was, she was very clear that I should sit on some classes, and they both had very different styles. Mr. Christian talked a lot in class, and stuff he said was brilliant, and the students took notes, and they were right there with him. They got on that train, and he I think was able to foster that love of literature in them that way through his own sort of passion. Mr. Schmick was more like, I'd like to hear the students talk, and so he would throw out prompts and conversation starters, and then he would kind of let the students have their discussion. So I got to see a bunch of different, or at least a couple different ways of doing it. But to be honest, I just focused on the stories.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was intimidating. I had never been a teacher. I was not certified, but the idea of discussing great stories, I could wrap my head around that.
And were you always into that? Was English always your subject? I mean, obviously you studied it in college, but from a young age you loved books.
I did. I remember reading The Hobbit in 9th grade, and when I really started reading for fun, and it was a recommendation from another friend of mine who was a little ahead of me, and then he just started throwing science fiction and like Frank Herbert and other fantasy sci-fi authors, Piers Anthony, my way, and I started reading series of books, and that I think is when I fell in love with stories.
Wow, it's interesting because I loved books from as far back as I can remember, always reading, but I never got into like the science fiction, and even Harry Potter was a bit of a stretch for me. The like fantasy, mystical, made up stuff, I never really took to that.
Yeah,
that's like a part of my reading experience that I just don't have.
Yeah, sure. It wasn't until college that I got exposed to I remember reading The Catcher in the Rye in high school. That was a great experience to see myself in a protagonist and relate to a character that way that was real, not fantasy or sci-fi. And then I remember reading A Clockwork Orange as a senior, and I did sort of a capstone project on that senior year. And that Anthony Burgess, that was a great combination of, for me, like creating a world to the point where there was like Russian vocabulary in it.
Mm-hmm.
There was a glossary at the end of the book with the words that he had created from like Russian slang and English together. And but it also had this dystopian kind of, this was what the world could become like feel.
Mm. What was the 9th grade curriculum like when you first started versus today?
Yeah, it was in some ways the same, Shakespeare and Dickens, but with the autonomy to teach whatever Shakespeare and whatever Dickens you wanted to. So over the years, I've taught different plays and different Dickens books. But then we used to do To Kill a Mockingbird, Fences by August Wilson. That might have been, I think that was. It was like Shakespeare first quarter, Dickens second quarter, To Kill a Mockingbird third quarter, and Fences fourth quarter.
Mm-hmm.
So we've increased the number of books that we're teaching. Oh, at the time we would do supplemental reading. So I would have a book each quarter that I felt paired well with the book that we were studying in class, and the students had to read it during that quarter on their own.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, that was kind of cool. So I could pair like Animal Farm with A Tale of Two Cities.
Yeah.
So, stuff like that. I think that got to be a little much for the students to be reading 2 books for English while they were trying to juggle their other courses. So that kind of went away. But we now teach more books during the year. So instead of just 2 books in the second semester, I'm still teaching Fences. I'm not teaching To Kill a Mockingbird anymore. Fences, Between the World and Me, Everything I Never Told You, which is a Celeste Ng kind of mystery, and The Laramie Project.
Everything I've Never Told You. Yeah, I'm curious how the 9th grade curriculum chooses the text for the year, because it obviously changes every couple of years. Is there just a group conversation, or what types of themes or ideas are you looking for in the 9th grade curriculum?
So if there's a guiding theme in the 9th grade curriculum, it's empathy, which is very broad and really allows us to do all sorts of consider all sorts of stories. But that's sort of where we begin. We want the students to be able to imagine themselves in stories and imagine themselves in character shoes and be able to relate what they're reading to themselves and our world today. So it's very broad strokes. We're also trying to make sure that students are getting able to see themselves in the literature, no matter what their background might be. So having having representation from the LGBTQ community, the Asian American community, that was important, and that didn't used to happen.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So it's diversified the curriculum and changed in certain ways. Since the time you started teaching 9th grade English at Gilman till now, what are the reasons that you've stuck with the 9th grade as kind of your I would guess that's your favorite age to teach, your favorite group to teach, 9th grade.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, I taught American Lit for a little while, and I've always had the senior electives to pair with, but mostly English 9 sections, you're right. Wow, gosh, what's cool about it? I guess really being in terms of the English department, really being a student's introduction to upper school, so helping them bridge middle school to upper school. I don't know, there's something still very innocent, I guess, in terms of where they're coming from. Maybe innocent is the wrong word. Unworldly, or not being worldly. And there's a really I get a real pleasure from being able to say, okay, so now here's upper school English. This is what you've been doing. Here's how this is going to be different. And to be honest with you, the LA program in the middle school does a lot of the same. Builds the same skills and seeks to instill the same sort of principles and ideas. So in some ways, it's not a big transition. But in other ways, I think asking them to go below the text and really consider how they relate to a text personally, and maybe going that next step deeper is the biggest thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you read a couple of plays in your classes, and you're a playwright yourself, and that's obviously a passion of yours. I'd love some help even in some of the plays that I read in my junior and senior curriculums. We read All My Sons in my leadership and character class, and Death of a Salesman, and a few more. And what are some of your strategies in your teaching style that allows you to effectively teach plays, and maybe some strategies for teaching theater in the classroom?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say you got to get it up on its feet. So I taped out a stage in my 3rd floor classroom, just with Mr. Flint's help. We taped out a little thrust stage on the floor, and we've got the students sitting around the edges of the stage like audience members, and then we get up and we act out scenes. So I think that would be the first thing. Most plays are meant to be, not that they don't work being read as literature. I think they can and they do, but most are meant to be acted out. Mm-hmm. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing I would say is it's great to take a student and say, okay, you were playing this character. The last time we did it, now switch and play this other character. And so you're literally putting them in the shoes of another character so they can see a different perspective. That's pretty cool. And then if you throw in all the technical elements, like, okay, well, if you were designing the lights for this scene, what would the lights look like? And what sound would you have playing in the background? And describe the costumes and the props and, really get them to almost create the world or imagine the world.
Yeah, I have sometimes I have difficulty when students, sometimes they don't love reading the actual play, but when you come into the classroom and you either show like something visual or act it out, it really does bring it to life, and you can actually talk about it at that point because you see parts of the stage direction or mannerisms that you wouldn't have picked up on.
Yeah.
If you're just reading.
And improv can work. If I have a couple students that aren't crazy about getting up and reading from the script, I might say, okay, well, don't worry about the scripts. Let's improv a scene where you're a father and you're the son, right? And you're coming home and you've done something that your dad's not happy with, and let's see what happens and go, And so sometimes that works to get to the same, or to get to a point that intersects with what they would have been reading.
Yeah, you'd think that the improv would work really well in the junior curriculum, because I always have troubles with the girls and the boys in the classroom for the same time, especially the class I teach today. It's still kind of an awkward air in there, but that would be the perfect way to help loosen up the room and get people comfortable with each other.
Sure. There are a lot of fun warm-up games that I do. There was one, we were doing poetry I start the year with a poetry unit before Shakespeare, and there's an improv game called Rhyme Time, where you get two volunteers, and I guess the structure of the game is it's a wrestling match, like a WWE wrestling match, but instead of physical wrestling, it's wrestling with words. And so you get two volunteers and you get a word from the audience, like blue, and then they start insulting one another. And the only rule is that the last word of their sentence has to rhyme with the word from the audience. So I might say, Mr. Scott, I'm going to beat you till you're back black and blue. And then you would say,
this is a day that Mr. Malkus, you're going to rue.
Nice, right. And then we just keep going back and forth. So that's for poetry, that works well as like a warm-up. But the principles of like yes and improv, you're always yes anding anything that anybody gives you on stage. You're never saying no. You're saying yes, and then you're adding to it. That's good life advice.
Yeah. So improv, how did you get into it in the first place?
Sure. There was an improv group when I was an undergraduate at Towson University. I eventually transferred to Brooklyn College, but I did 3 years at Towson first. And there was an improv group that performed in the student union every Wednesday at lunch. They were called Yet to Be Named Improv, and they were theater majors, and they were older. I was like a freshman or sophomore, and these were juniors and seniors, and they had taken a few classes as part of their program. I think I was an English major at the time, or an education major. And, I just went and watched and fell in love with what they were doing and how they were able to do it. It blew my mind that they could be putting these scenes together, and none of it was written down. And I eventually declared myself a theater major and started taking some classes. And even though it's improv, there are some important principles that you learn that enable you to look like what you're doing is, like effortless. But there are guiding principles that really facilitate that.
Yeah, it's interesting because the improv or the theater, like this summer at Bread Loaf, we had a class where the professor brought in the acting crew, and their whole task was to get everyone up and doing improv and working together to, I guess, foster a theater-like environment. Sure. And it was so fascinating to me watching some people in the room were super into it and, they bought in right away. Other people in the room shut down right away. They didn't want any part of it. Right. They weren't going to snap their fingers. They weren't going to dance around the room. they shut it down.
Right.
So
yeah, there's nothing to hide behind when you're doing improv. There's no character that you're playing. It's just you, and that can be really intimidating. And also to say yes to everything. I mean, there are some suggestions that you might get from a partner, and there might be roads that you don't want to go down, but you can't say no.
yeah,
So
it's just part of it.
it can be intimidating. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in terms of acting and theater, improv by far, but it's also the best training and the most rewarding stuff you can do.
So you're from Maryland originally. Can you talk a little bit about your upbringing here and where you went to high school and what your high school experience was like?
I will. I grew up in Essex, eastern Baltimore County, went to public school, Baltimore County Public School, and really had a transformative experience in high school with an English teacher named Nancy Powell-Krowski. We called her Miss Powell. And similar to Gilman, there wasn't a high school theater department, but there were English teachers that directed plays, and every once in a while would teach a class when they could. But they did all of that outside of their English teaching duties. So Miss Powell was that person. She directed a fall play and a spring musical every year, and taught English. And so she was, I can remember listening to morning announcements as a ninth grader, and I was not going to be an athlete, but a friend and I decided that we would go audition for the play that we heard that they were doing. And the two of us went in together so that, we wouldn't be alone. And we both got cast in little tiny parts in that fall play. And it was a similar kind of thing as to Gilman, in that you would, you sort of pay your dues and work your way up, and you play bigger parts. And it just became my extracurricular activity of choice. And by the time you get to be junior or senior, you're playing bigger parts, and it's kind of I don't know, it became a big part of my identity.
And outside of school, were there ways when you were growing up, or are there ways now for students to like work on their theater or their, I'm used to talking about athletics, and you play for a club team or you play for another team. Like, what's the equivalent of that in the theater world?
Oh, that's a great question. There are ways. Most of it centers around community theater, and Baltimore was partly because of its geographical position between D.C. and Philly and New York. Baltimore has always had a very active community theater scene, and community theater basically just means volunteer theater. And so these are spaces that, most of them have their roots in the early to mid 1900s. These community theaters were formed. Some of them even go back further than that. And it's just regular people who have a love of theater that give up their evenings and weekends to, pick a season of plays, and, pick directors and have auditions and cast them, and people produce the plays. They show up, they build sets, they gather costumes and all that. And there's a real range. There are community theaters that are 100% volunteer, and now we sort of have a second tier of community theater in Baltimore that's like semi-professional, that pays kind of the people involved a stipend, but it's not enough to make your living at that. And then we have the professional, like Center Stage and Everyman kind of equity union houses. But that's the way. If you're not going to study it in college, you can audition for these community theaters, get cast. We offer, at the one that I'm a member of, Fells Point Corner Theater, we offer education classes. So we have acting classes for kids, acting classes for adults.
And how often do you participate in that?
That's my wife is the board president, so I participate quite frequently. I'm not acting much anymore. I used to do that. I used to act quite a bit, but it's so time intensive to teach and then have another full-time job at night.
Right.
I used to have that energy, but I don't anymore. So mostly what I'm doing now is producing. So I'm like the guy who is the person who is facilitating, getting auditions lined up and finding someone to build the set and going somewhere to get a costume, that kind of thing.
So at Gilman, What was your role in terms of like the plays and the musicals throughout your career? I know Mr. Rowell, John Rowell, runs the musical now, directs the musical, but over the course of your career here at Gilman, like how have you kind of been active as a director?
Yeah, sure. So there have been a few plays that we've done in the fall. It's gotten trickier because Bryn Mawr and Roland Park now produce fall musicals.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes there aren't enough boys to produce a fall play while the two girls' schools are casting our students in musicals. So it's tricky. But in the past, I've directed Rhinoceros by Eugene Ionesco. We did that one in Centennial Hall. That was my first play as a director, and that was probably 10 or 15 years ago now. We did Biloxi Blues by Neil Simon. We did that in Centennial Hall as well, smaller, more intimate space. And then Miss Carper and I directed Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot in the auditorium. That was probably the most recent one. I want to say there's another one, but I can't remember. So nothing near the scale of what Mr. Rowell's done. It's sort of the fall play has become kind of a catch as catch can. Like if we happen to have the willing students that want to do it that aren't in the musicals.
Right. Yeah, you put out the feelers and see who can make it out. How many people do you really need, do you think, to put on a play? I guess it depends on what you're doing, but
yeah, it does. There were 5 people in Waiting for Godot. That was our smallest cast. And so with Biloxi Blues, it was more. It was 6, 7, 8, and Rhinoceros had a large cast. But I have plans. I have plans if we ever do, the next time we find ourselves with a surplus of actors in the fall, or that I can sort of maybe talk to Miss Carper the spring before. Anyway, there's a great company called the Reduced Shakespeare Company that have written a bunch of fun plays. One's called The Complete Works of Shakespeare, Abridged, where they do all the plays of Shakespeare in 2 hours.
Oh my gosh.
But it's abridged, so you get a line or two from...
You've really got to know your Shakespeare.
It's pretty funny. And mostly Act 1 is Romeo and Juliet, and Act 2 is Hamlet, but there are other... Anyway, they also wrote one called The Complete History of America, Abridged, which is hysterically funny, that I was in years ago, and I was thinking it would be a really fun show to direct here at Gilman, and it only requires 3 actors. What
do they include in that play?
You start with the founding of the country, and how, for instance, how they're very witty and they're very sensitive, these 3 writers. So what you're getting is a critique of the way American history has been told.
Right.
So, like, there's this whole song about Amerigo Vespucci, where, America takes our name. So we start there, the play starts there, and then it goes through, there's a lot of time spent on Watergate and, like, Vietnam, and I guess highlights from American history, but in a very, critical way, in terms of, some of the sensitive issues that our country hasn't always done a great job with. So my plan is that maybe ask Miss Carper if she'd be interested in co-directing again when we find our 3 actors.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of the play Mr. Rowell Teaches Assassins, which always interested me. I read it one year, and I was thinking about maybe teaching it, but I've always been super into the presidents and presidential trivia, and just having that, the background about each of these assassins, Wilkes Booth, and the James Garfield part is fascinating to me, because it wasn't technically the gunshot that killed him, it was the people reaching their hands into his wound.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Without antiseptic and knowing much about germs. Then
that'll do it.
Yeah, so I thought that was fascinating.
Yes, Sondheim is, he is American musical theater.
Yeah. So what do you think when you, I guess, fell in love with acting and plays? What do you think it is about plays that really captivates you?
Well, it sounds a little repetitive, but I was never interested in being a director, really. I'm happy to do it here at school, but I've always wanted to act. And it's the idea of putting on a character and being able to experience life through a person that's different than you are, usually, not always, but usually very different. And that idea of, so I don't know if you find yourself crying when you're reading or crying when you watch a movie, or, I mean, I'm just like a big pile of tears, mostly of emotion that's welling out of me. The few times that I've tried to, speak in front of people in the auditorium, I find myself, I get really emotional. Mm-hmm. And it's usually a really, not always, but usually, even when it's really positive.
Yeah.
And I like to think that it has to do with some appreciation of, the magnificence of life and how fortunate we all are. But all that being said, being an actor is one way, if you're sensitive like that, of really putting that to great use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The empathy component that's central to your course, it makes a lot of sense.
It does. It's a really, really, really great outlet for that.
So in your free time, how much time do you spend on, I guess, researching plays and reading plays? And if you were going to pick up a book or any type of literature, would it be a play? Like what types of ways do you incorporate that into your outside world, I guess?
I do read a lot of plays, but mostly that's to whether we're going to consider them to be produced. Although, occasionally a play like Angels in America will come along, or a musical like Assassins that really begs for consideration in the literary genre, as well as, hey, this is a play we want to see produced. This is a play I just want to sit down and read. But no, when I pick up a book, I think it's usually either through some sort of recommendation, colleagues, going to conferences, and hearing people talk about books that have been transformational to them. I have favorite authors. Like whenever I get a chance and I don't have to read anything, if Stephen King has written a new book, I will buy that book. And
really?
Sit and read it.
So I haven't read too much Stephen King.
I've got every one of his books.
What's your favorite?
The Stand.
The Stand.
Yeah, The Stand is about a super flu that has disseminated the earth, and there are two camps of survivors left, and it's like the good versus evil. It's a wonderful book, really thick book.
Yeah.
But the other author I collect is Kurt Vonnegut, so he's another big.
What's your favorite Vonnegut?
Oh gosh, I like his. I think he only wrote one play, which is called Happy Birthday, Wanda June. So he's not a dramatist, but he wrote a play, and it's really good. Cat's Cradle, probably.
Yeah, I've never read that. What is Cat's Cradle about?
Oh gosh, it explores some of the same themes that all of Vonnegut's work explores. He's so good at turning the light on different parts of society and critiquing them. He's such a good satirist in terms of pointing out the hypocritical nature of authority, and but also, so that's like one level of his work, and on another level, he's really able to be poignant and get to the heart of human relationships. So his books work on different levels, which is what I love about him. There's
a short story by him that I taught in my short story class last year.
Is it Harrison Bergeron?
Harrison Bergeron. That's an amazing story.
It's a great story.
There's a short movie that's like 20 minutes long on the internet somewhere, and I showed that too, and does a pretty good job of
I'll have to check
depicting all the weights that Harrison has to wear,
right.
And yeah, it's an incredible story.
It really is.
But I know there's a Vonnegut documentary somewhere.
I think I have seen a few of those.
You have?
Yep. And recently for Burn Book Week, there's a video link I sent to the librarians, who then sent it out to the English department, and it's Benedict Cumberbatch reading the letter that Kurt Vonnegut sent the Drake School Board in North Dakota in 1973 when they banned Slaughterhouse-5.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so this was one of the first times that Vonnegut had been banned, and I think what prompted the letter was that not only did this school board ban the books, they threw the books they banned into the school incinerator and they burned them. So Vonnegut wrote a letter talking about why that's awful.
What are some of the things he says in the letter?
Well, he just says that he basically uses a letter to say, I think you're under a bunch of misconceptions about me and my work. And he talks about how you must think that at the heart of my work, I want to introduce kids to things that you don't want them learning about, and maybe like sex or drugs or profanity. He said at the heart of all of his books is that the message that we have to be kinder to one another. So that's the thing that I took away. But this letter is basically him saying, you might have some misconceptions about me. Let me tell you about myself. And he's got the Purple Heart. He's a decorated combat infantryman.
Oh, I didn't know he had a Purple Heart.
Oh yeah. He survived the bombing of Dresden, which basically is where Slaughterhouse-Five came in.
Yeah, the banned book entire thing is fascinating to me because all of the books that we've been talking about, Catcher in the Rye and some of the other ones you've mentioned, they were all at some point banned.
It's true. That's one of the things he says in this letter is, my publisher and I are not celebrating the fact that you've banned my book, even though it's going to result in thousands and thousands of copies being sold of this book that you have banned. And so he says, we're not capitalizing on that. We're not gloating about that. Anyway, yeah, you're right.
I wonder if there's someone who has, I don't know, do you have certain opinions about banned books? I mean, I probably take the side that says you should read like all books should be available for people to read, but I'd wonder hearing from someone on the opposing side of that discussion.
Right. So the closest I can get to that is we had a conversation in the English department. I'm sure were part of this, probably 5 to 10 years ago. We in my teaching of like To Kill a Mockingbird, for instance, when I first started teaching that book, I thought, it has the N-word. And then I taught Huckleberry Finn when I was teaching American Lit, which is also rife with the N-word. At the time, when I first started teaching these works, I thought, wow, it's probably really important for students to hear these words so that they can understand how awful this is and maybe why we should never do this again and say this. And so Mike Molina came on to the English faculty a few years ago, and Mike had a story that he told his students, I think in American Lit, having to do with Huckleberry Finn, and he talked about how that word, the M-word, triggered him specifically because of an experience that he had when he was a young boy. Mm-hmm. And he would tell that, and there was a Baltimore Stoop story that Mike did that's you can find on the internet, where he talks about what that word, every time he hears that word, what he relives in his head. And so it made me think differently about the work, and that I don't have the right to, re-traumatize someone just because I think it's important to recognize how awful this word is. So we have sensitive language policies now, and I think that's, speaking personally, that was so important for me to wrap my head around, and so important for my students that now they understand that they don't have to worry about hearing that word read aloud in class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that conversation that we had has always interested me with Mike's opinions in that conversation, some other people's opinions and things that I'd never really thought of before. It gets complicated in classroom setting because of that discussion between harm versus intent, which I think is filled with a lot of different people have different thoughts on. Well, we're reading a book, it's not intended to hurt anyone, yet some people would say, well, it does anyway, so sure. Right. But yeah, I've thought a lot about that issue, and there's a 60 Minutes I think it's on Huckleberry Finn, and it has should people read this book, and that, especially that word, the N-word, it affects certain people when they hear it or read it, and there are different sides on all of these issues, which makes them not very easy. But we do have in the English department, the sensitive language policy, which.
And so to go back to your question about banned books, I certainly would want people to have the freedom to be exposed to any idea that they choose to read about. And I don't think we should necessarily limit the opportunities of what they will read. But in a school setting, it's probably important that we take some time to think about, like you said, intent versus harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So going back to your career here at Gilman and teaching in the English department, what have been, I guess, some of your favorite books or plays to teach? What do you really get passionate or excited about teaching every year?
So thanks. That's a great question. I teach the first semester senior elective called Writers in Revolt, which is a class I inherited from Jeff Christ, who was department head before Patrick. And I think he inherited from a predecessor. But anyway, the great part of the class, I think, is that it really encourages students to embrace the role of rebel and revolter and push back against society's expectations and norms that may seem unfair or unjust to them. And we read literature that comes out of different points of time and place where writers were pushing back on norms that seemed unfair or unjust to them. So, the play we start with that we're reading now is The Normal Heart, which is an early 80s play by Larry Kramer that was written when AIDS was exploding in New York City. And despite the fact that gay men were dying at an alarming rate from a disease that nobody could wrap their head around, the world at large, the city of New York, the mayor's office, the medical community, the media, wanted very little to do with it because it seemed to only be affecting IV drug users and gay men. So there's a lot of injustice in there that the play was written to address. So then we read The Awakening by Kate Chopin, which is like 1899, about a woman in New Orleans who wants to be more than just a wife and a mother in all of the ways that society says, no, that's it. That's all you can do. And we do a satire unit, which is one of my favorites, right? Using satire to point out the foibles of society and the hypocrisy. So that's definitely one of my favorites, that class. And then the students, as we're going through, they engineer a revolt. They decide on something they want to revolt against. And they do that throughout the semester, and there are like 5 phases that they have to hit, and we learn about different revolt techniques they might consider using, and they gather data, and then they have a revolt.
Let me guess, the dress code is a big favorite.
It has been. I've tried to dissuade them because there isn't much more that can, it's pretty lax now, to be honest.
Pretty lax.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
But some do get up in arms. But we've had some great revolts over the years. There was a revolt and it's a coordinated class. So we've had young women that have pushed back about some really interesting things: reproductive rights, stigma around birth control pills, feminine hygiene products in the bathrooms here at Gilman. All sorts of great ideas have come out. Thomas Booker, who's now, I think, been drafted on an NFL team, his revolt a few years ago was about how unfair it is to be an NCAA athlete in a high-profile sport like football and not be able to profit in any way from your name, image, and likeness. And then he went to Stanford, and 3 years later,
right.
So he's a little bitter because he missed out on it, but
oh yeah,
I'm sure he'll do fine. But yeah, so sometimes it's fun to watch the revolts. Actually, it's clear that other people are thinking the same thing around the country. That's
so interesting because it feels like for a couple of years at least when I was paying attention, especially when Johnny Manziel was playing and he was like the biggest, and Tim Tebow, they're like the biggest quarterbacks and selling out arenas, and they couldn't make money at all on their likeness or their jerseys or whatever, and it just seems like that switch flipped so quickly, and then it was like, all right, you guys are fine, and it's like,
I think the speed at which that switch flipped is, I think, directly correlates to how ridiculous it was that these schools and divisions were making tens of millions of dollars.
Right.
And the students weren't making a penny. I mean, they were getting a free education, but even that, I mean, just to listen to Thomas talk about what it means to be a D1 football player in terms of taking class and then doing everything else that is expected of you because you're on scholarship, you have very little of the normal college experience or the traditional college experience. It's more like a job.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And you may know that, Mr. Scott.
Yeah. Maybe not to the extent of a, Stanford football player, but pretty similar. I mean, it takes up your whole life almost. So,
right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I would have made any money if I was, if I was allowed to, but, I think people should be able to in college for sure.
Absolutely.
So you came up with that course.
No, I inherited that course. I have tweaked it over the years.
Yeah.
The literature is mine that we read now, and the project sort of existed, but I nailed it down so that there are benchmarks that have to be hit, so that there's no way at the end of the semester that a senior cannot have spent a substantial amount of time thinking about this and doing stuff. So I'm very proud of structuring that course, but the idea came from others.
Yeah. And have you created other electives in the past?
I'm glad you asked that. I created an elective called Gay and Lesbian Literature a few years back that we ran for about 3 years, and then we haven't run it for 2 years now. There hasn't been interest, but that was I think a really important thing that happened, and that just happened because there was a critical mass of students that were clearly looking for a class where they could see themselves, and that didn't currently exist. And so I put that together.
And you have a book recommendation that you brought in that you used in this class?
I do. It's by our own Mr. John Rowell. And John wrote this. It's a collection of short stories. It's called The Music of Your Life. And this was one of the books that we read when he was applying to be the Tickner Fellow, which is how Mr. Rowell started at Gilman. And it is a beautiful book. And it's, going back to what I said about tears, there are 4 stories in here that I taught that without fail would make me cry every time we discussed them in class, including the story that the collection is named for, The Music of Your Life, which is one of the best stories and maybe the only story I've ever read written in second person.
Interesting.
That is incredibly effective at what it aims to do.
I'm going to have to
check it out.
Yeah, check it out. Oh, that's great. What is your other recommendation?
Oh, so this is Ross Gay. He's a poet. It's funny, we had him at Gilman years ago, earlier in his career. One of the Tickner Fellows brought him in as a writer at work. And he's a National Book Award poet. National Book Critics Circle Award and a National Book Award finalist. Anyway, he's a poet. He's a black man, and he came to Gilman early in his career as a guest in the Writers at Work series. And, there was some pushback after he read here about his affect as he read. So he had a hoodie, and he had his hoodie pulled up, and he seemed to be, I don't know if he made a comment. I'm trying to remember if he said he was hungover, but he made, he was, he read his poetry, and his poetry was wonderful, but I think he did it in such a way that ruffled the feathers of some of the administration, perhaps, and faculty. And Ross Gay has gone on to, now he's a professor at Indiana Bloomington, and he wrote this book called The Book of Delights, which is not poetry. It's a daily. He wrote a short essay a day.
Right, they're like a page long.
Yeah, and it's like the title suggests. delights that he noticed in his everyday life. So he's a gardener and he loves food, and so many of the essays are about the plants that are growing in his garden or something that he ate. And a lot of them are about his experience as a gay man, as a black man, and they're just wonderful because they kind of get you to stop, slow down, and he encourages the reader to find the delights every day in their life, no matter what, to pay attention. So that's another favorite.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was thinking about I've been using some gratitude in my classroom a little bit last year too, and it's very tough to, I don't know, I just wouldn't respond well if someone was like, write down what you're grateful for. Like I don't know. Sure. I don't think that comes off that well, but I think actually the research on gratitude and why it's becoming like, it's one of the ways to like boost your self-esteem and just overall happiness in life is to reflect and find some gratitude. The best way to do that is to describe something like very small in detail, like write a page like this about something very minor in your life that's giving you pleasure or happiness.
Yep.
And I sometimes do that in my classes, like just think about one little thing and write a page about what exactly is it about, your mother's breakfast or your father's whatever, your math teacher's teaching style that you like so much. And I think it can, I don't do it as consistently as I should. I'm doing other things, but I think it definitely has probably affected Roscoe in a really like great way, despite the the book, just in his personal life.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by the Roscoe that came to Gilman that we all met 20 years ago, and the Roscoe that wrote this book.
Yeah.
He clearly has had a journey that has resulted in his being able to take delight in the smallest things on a daily basis.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for bringing those in.
Sure.
So maybe a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure.
So Larry, just thinking about Gilman and being here and teaching here for a little while, what is it that like is so important to you about Gilman as a place, and what do you, I guess, love best about the school?
Oh my gosh, it sounds so corny, Mr. Scott.
Jake. But it really is the people, in that if I didn't enjoy the people that I got to interact with on a daily basis, it would not be the job it is to me today, which is I look forward to coming to work most days. The variety that we are allowed to experience on a daily basis in terms of what the school asks us to do, but also in some cases allows us to do, really makes the time fly by. For instance, I got a master's in school counseling, but if I were a school counselor at a public school, that's all I would get to do, would be to, sit in the guidance office and be a counselor. One of the things I love about Gilman is the ability to teach various grade levels, propose classes based on interests, coach. I coach intramural, flag football, ultimate frisbee currently.
That frisbee looks fun.
It is. It's a good time. And a theater intramural with Mr. Rowell every winter. That's, I think the closest thing we have to a theater curriculum here at Gilman. And that's when I get to share what I love about improv with students. And then, that we have advisees that we get to hang out with for 4 years. That's a pretty neat way to get to know a student. A great relationship to have. And, it's, I think just like it's a gift to attend here as a student, in many ways, I feel like it's a gift to teach here.
Yeah, I agree.
Small classes,
Yeah. Now, is there any ways that you feel like Gilman has changed over the course of your career, for better or for worse, that you've identified?
I haven't thought about that in terms of being able to put my finger on things, but I can tell you in terms of focus on community and inclusion and equity, and the way Gilman has reacted to the times when our community, whether it's the country or Baltimore or our school community, has fallen short. I don't think I can overstate the leadership of Mr. Smythe and Mr. Hubeck in terms of me being proud and believing that Gilman's heart is in the right place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that has changed, but I don't know if that's. I'd like to think Gilman was founded on principles that have evolved and are now evolved to where they need to be for today's world. Not that was a given that they would. So I think it's a real tribute to the leadership of the school and our colleagues and the staff that Gilman is a place, I hope, where kids and adults feel like they belong no matter what.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I feel like the way the school has responded to so many unexpected and very fast-moving changes in the country with the pandemic, and just thinking about our jobs in educating students and giving them the skills that they're going to need in the world, especially a world where, you know, things happen so fast with technology. It's pretty daunting of a task, but I agree that Gilman administration and just the school has done a great job responding to, you know, we've lived through some wild times these past couple of years.
Right. And the tri-school, I think it's really important that the tri-schools have committed to staying, you know, in this consortium academically. I love having co-ed classes for those last 2 years. I think it's really important for the students. And as much as, you know, sometimes I might not want to go coach, and believe me, I know as an intramural coach, compared to an interscholastic coach, I'm carrying a very light load. But it is absolutely true that the principles that I get to model and put into practice and insist on others putting into practice on the field or in the rehearsal room are the same principles that we're trying to, you know, pull out of the literature and help us all become better human beings. You know, empathy and sportsmanship and all those things. I find myself doing that on the ultimate frisbee field.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I was really into the U.S. Open this year, watching all the tennis matches, and I thought it was so impressive at the final game between Carlos Alcaraz and what's Ruud's first name? Casper Ruud.
Okay.
They had the trophy presentation, and, you know, they give the runner-up prize to Casper Ruud and then the trophy to Carlos Alcaraz, and both players were allowed to speak for a little bit. And, you know, one's from Norway, one's from Spain, and this was on 9/11, acknowledging 9/11 in front of the United States, and you couldn't really tell, honestly, who the winner and the loser was from the words they were saying. And I just think that was such a perfect example of how sports can, like, model a lot of these principles that we're trying to teach here. They come through in those moments. So that really, I tried to show that to some of my classes because it was impressive.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, so you guys out on the frisbee? What is it? The field?
I don't know if it's the frisbee pitch or the field. Yeah, we're looking forward to it today.
Cool. Well, Mr. Malkus, thank you very much for coming in. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Scott. I appreciate it.
Oh.